opening the center immediately to facilitate piece development and claim central squares. Anchoring the center with a pawn immediately challenges white's central ambition, setting the stage for a classical pawn structure. Asserting central dominance, white immediately contests black's pawn and opens avenues for queen and bishop development. Solidifying the pawn center, this aims for a robust Slav structure, a familiar and reliable defense. Developing this knight smoothly prepares for pawn advances and supports central control, aiming to unravel the position gradually. Developing this knight immediately challenges the center and prepares for pawn structure decisions. Securing central influence, this knight reinforces the pawn chain's integrity while preparing for further development. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, this pawn advance elegantly supports the d5 pawn and sets up a robust pawn structure for the queen side. Establishing immediate pressure on the knight, this bishop sortie anticipates potential piece exchanges and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Challenging the bishop's influence immediately, this pawn thrust forces white's hand and potentially creates a useful defensive screen. Sacrificing the bishop here opens lines and creates structural weaknesses for black's queenside, a bold attempt to gain initiative. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately centralizes her, but leaves the king's pawn structure slightly compromised for now. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure sets up for a controlled development, aiming for a comfortable middle game. Retreating the queen to d8 cleverly repositions for potential central counterplay, and offers a safe haven from the bishop's pressure. Repositioning the bishop to g2 allows it to eye the queenside and potentially support a central pawn push later. A subtle repositioning, the bishop now eyes the queenside, aiming to bolster the pawn chain's defense. Securing the monarch paves the way for piece activation and potential central expansion. The king is finally safe, solidifying your pawn structure and preparing for central development. Unlocking the center with the pawn aims to seize initiative and create dynamic play by challenging black's pawn structure and opening lines for white's pieces. Releasing the central tension frees up the queenside and opens lines, but leaves the pawn structure slightly compromised. Unlocking the queenside diagonal for the bishop and preparing to contest the central tension by supporting the e-pawn advance. Challenging the queenside pawn chain, black aims to create active counterplay and disrupt white's central influence. Securing the d-file's dominance for a potential future assault on black's queenside pawn structure. Boldly pushing the pawn, black aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain immediate space. Retreating the knight to b1 seems to consolidate the queenside and prepare for a central pawn push, a cautious yet potent redirection of forces. Asserting queenside pressure, black's bishop now eyes the d3 square, aiming to disrupt white's kingside castling plans and potentially exploit the open b-file. Centralizing the queen intensifies pressure on black's queenside pawn chain, while preparing a potential kingside advance. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the d-file. Reinforcing the knight's outpost on c4 and preparing a potential kingside assault. Boldly reinforcing the queenside pawn chain, the knight eyes promising outposts on c4 or a4, aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward piece placement. Repositioning the bishop to f1 aims to free the d-file and potentially support a kingside pawn push later. Unleashing a pawn storm, black fights for queenside initiative and challenges white's central control by opening lines. Sacrificing the central pawn clarifies the pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open c-file and pressure black's queenside. Reclaiming the pawn is sound, but the bishop now occupies a passively blocked square, surrendering central influence. Capturing the pawn opens lines, creating immediate tactical dynamism and forcing black into defensive calculations. Relocating the queen to c7 centralizes it, eyeing white's pawn on c5 while preparing to contest the c-file. Knight redeployment to a5 targets the queenside pressure point, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and preparing to seize initiative. Trading the bishop eliminates a defensive piece, potentially opening the b-file for more pressure. Exposing the king initiates a daring positional gamble, potentially opening lines for swift tactical onslaughts or sacrificing structural integrity for active piece play. Placing the rook on the open file directly challenges white's central pawn structure and prepares for future incursions. Exchanging rooks simplifies the position, opening the d-file for further pressure and potentially leading to a queenside advantage. Forcing the trade of rooks simplifies the position dramatically, paving the way for an active queen and potential pawn thrusts. Unlocking the c-file's potential, white initiates a crucial pressure sequence against black's potentially exposed queenside pieces. Reconnecting the knight to the central fight aims to revive black's dormant pieces. The knight's repositioning to the kingside anticipates a potential blockade and prepares for queenside operations. Opening the queenside for counterplay, this maneuver aims to exploit the isolated pawn. Securing the king's safety is paramount before further engaging the central queenside struggle. Re-establishing the bishop to a more passive square sacrifices active piece play for a semblance of defensive solidity. Pivoting the queen aggressively challenges the pawn structure and aims to dominate the critical 7th rank. A subtle preparation for kingside expansion and potentially challenging the isolated c-pawn. Securing the c-file, this rook activation boldly challenges black's pawn structure. A pivotal exchange that simplifies the position and clears the way for rook activity on the open file. A tactical pawn fork now opens the rook to the open file, threatening the king. Reorganizing the bishop's defense of the king's wing after the exchange offers a flexible repositioning. The knight repositions, seeking new attacking avenues on the queenside, while white prepares to contest the open files with increased force. This piece repositions your knight, seeking active squares and a better grip on the central control. This capture resolves the knight's awkward outpost and simplifies into a potentially favorable rook endgame for white. Recapturing the bishop solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to activate the remaining pieces. Aims to activate the rook on the open c-file for potential queenside pressure. Attempting to activate the rook on the open file, but it leaves the queenside somewhat passive. A necessary repositioning to centralize the king and prepare for further action. Reinforcing the central pawn structure while preparing for potential piece maneuvering. Shifting the king towards the center aims to activate it for the ensuing endgame. Securing the king's safety is paramount in this simplified structure, as it prepares for potential pawn advances. This knight's journey to c6 aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially infiltrate their weakened queenside structure. A bold attempt to gain queenside space, but it might open too many avenues for the opponent's remaining pieces. The monarch advances, seeking central influence and preparing for the endgame's simplified realities. Finally, the bishop finds a purpose, preparing to contest the open c-file. Pushing the king forward asserts dominion, aiming to liberate its mobility and potentially join the fight on the queenside. Activating the king is crucial in this simplified landscape. It must now navigate towards the queenside to support the pawn structure. Unlocking the kingside and threatening to invade, this king maneuver aims to exploit the open lines and advance its dominion. Redirecting the bishop to the queenside aims to challenge white's advancing king and prevent its easy infiltration. Reinforcing the d-file, white prepares to challenge black's isolated rook and create new attacking avenues. Initiating pawn expansion on the kingside offers a chance to disrupt white's controlled structure. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, this move aims to secure the monarch from potential future pawn breaks. Expanding the kingside pawn structure offers counterplay against the white king's somewhat exposed position. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, preparing for a potential queenside expansion or consolidation. Pushing this pawn forward opens up attacking lines for the black queen and bishop, but risks weakening the kingside pawn structure. Opening the g-file creates immediate threats against black's kingside pawns and potentially activates the white rook. The pawn structure now opens a path for the rook, but the king remains exposed. Seizing space on the kingside with the pawn thrust, aiming to create attacking opportunities and restrict black's piece mobility. Opening the c-file now allows for immediate pressure on white's vulnerable king. Pushing the king into the pawn chain forces a difficult decision for black's queenside pawns. Fighting for control of the open c-file becomes paramount after this pawn recapture. The king ventures into the heart of the enemy position, seeking to disrupt black's pawn structure. Initiating a decisive raid with the rook, hoping to disrupt white's king safety and unravel the pawn structure. Pushing the king to the 6th rank forces a critical decision and creates potential mating nets. A desperate attempt to reignite counterplay, banking on the king's active presence. Fleshing out pawn structure towards the king is key now. Desperate gambit to inject life into the game, hoping for counterplay on the king side. Asserting control of the open file aims to force concessions before the king escapes.